In tonight's South Bank show, we observe Ken Follett as he researches and develops over the last 3 years the sequel to his most successful book, The Pillars of the Earth. This one is called World Without End. Gerald Fox's film explores the writing of a best-selling novel.
When you stand in front of a cathedral like this, you wonder, how did it get here? Why was it built? Why did medieval people put up these wonderful buildings? It seemed to me that the only way to answer the question, why are the cathedrals there, was to write The Pillars of the Earth, which is a 1,000-page novel about building a cathedral. Quite a lot of people didn't want me to write The Pillars of the Earth. My publishers were very nervous about it. They said, so it's set in the Middle Ages, Ken, and it's about building a church, no Nazis, no secret agents, no KGB, and because publishers really like authors to repeat themselves, and they saw this as a very dangerous departure for me. When I finished it, I thought I had succeeded. I thought I had written a very long but very satisfying popular novel, and I thought it would sell much better than my previous books. And at first it did not. I was really kind of disappointed. Then slowly something began to happen. It sold 100,000 copies in Italy. I'd never sold that many in Italy before. It went onto the German bestseller list and it stayed there year after year. It was eventually 6 years on the German bestseller list. People began to talk to me about it in a way that they've never talked about my other books. And then people started to ask me to write a sequel. It took me 15 years to figure out what would count as a sequel. And I decided to write another book set in the same town and centred on the same cathedral and the priory around the cathedral. So most of the action of World Without End takes place in the church or in the precincts of the church.
Once I had decided to do the sequel, I began work on an outline of the story. After 9 months, I took my outline to New York and showed it to my most important literary advisor, my agent, Al Zuckerman.
Oh, it's nice to see you. Come on in.
Well, your main comment on this outline is that it rambles.
Yes.
That there's no focus. There's one way to deal with this would be to give each of the principals a dream of accomplishment that sustains them through the story. And that's sort of, but that's partly there.
Yeah, it is.
But maybe not strong enough.
One of the problems with the outline now is that so many of the conflicts are purely professional.
Yeah.
So what you really want is somehow to make this into something that is also personal.
Yeah. And sexual, if possible.
And sexual, if possible, right?
Well, there'll be a number of storylines that are associated with the cathedral and construction. The tower of the cathedral in Kingsbridge is going to crumble and collapse in the way that the Tower of York did in the 14th century. And I think probably for very similar reasons, because I quite like the story of how the foundations of York were too weak to take the weight of the magnificent tower that the bishop wanted to build. I think that's quite a nice story.
There was a low rumbling sound, so deep it was almost inaudible, and a tremor underfoot as if a tree had fallen nearby. The singing faltered. In the chancel, a crack appeared in the south wall, right next to the pier Merthin had been looking at. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw masonry falling in the choir and the crossing. Then there was nothing but noise. Women screaming, men shouting, and the deafening crash of huge stones hitting the floor.
Now, the foundations of York Minster are unusual, aren't they?
Yes, as they stand, yeah.
There's, in fact, it's built on a sort of raft made of wood and concrete.
During the building of the tower in the 14th century, they began to have problems. And
cracks began to appear.
Yeah, and they realised the foundations weren't going to be up to holding the amount of stonework they wanted.
And that's when the cracks appear.
Twist and collapse.
So in my story, when cracks start to appear in my fictional cathedral,
Yes.
this would be a very kind of authentic explanation.
Absolutely.
But of course, my medieval mason is going to have to investigate. There'll be a mystery. What interests me, a lot of writing about cathedrals is very sort of art history. It's about the elevation, does this work, and these proportions. Proportions are very important in the Middle Ages and in cathedral building, but what I'm actually interested in is the people who did it. You know, the people who carved these stones. The people who had the imagination to visualize this before it was built, this huge space, these enormous pillars that hold up that very heavy roof, the vault. The people could conceive this in their imaginations and then step by step work out how to build it. That fascinates me. Building York Minster in the Middle Ages is the equivalent of putting a man on the moon today. But there's also an element in the space programme, as there was in building a church like York Minster, an element of just a pure spiritual ambition in men and women. Just as we wanted to get to the moon, so medieval people wanted to build a huge church that was full of light like this. The drama in my books comes from the material problems of building cathedrals, and as for getting into the characters, I work on the assumption that 800 years ago people were probably pretty much the same as they are now. They were driven by the same passions and they committed the same sins, and so I treat them as if they were the people I know all around me, but just living in completely different physical circumstances. In the Middle Ages, when York Minster and all of these great cathedrals were built, there was no paper. So the architect or the master mason who designed it had to draw it, but he didn't have paper to draw on, and this was his substitute, this floor.
And as we look at it, there are so many superimposed drawings.
Yes.
The earliest drawing we've identified on this floor is a drawing of one of the windows of the Lady Chapel, which is upside down to us. Just over this area, you can see some tracery lines, and these are actually on the Lady Chapel at the east end of the Minster.
Which was presumably the last part to be built, the Lady Chapel? Yeah.
About 1360.
So eventually, when there are literally hundreds of drawings scratched in the floor, they can continue to use it by simply putting another layer of mortar over.
But they wanted it smooth, and they used stocking feet. And occasionally, there are places where the plaster hadn't gone off, and there are footprints.
You can imagine the mason saying,
what
"You idiot!"
But what did he say to the dog?
There's a dog.
There's a dog footprint over there.
Merthin has an ambition. He wants to build the tallest building in England. Mm-hmm. And it's the kind of thing that boys do grow up with that kind of ambition.
They do?
But I don't know why. There needs to be something that drives Merthin and doesn't drive other boys to say, when I grow up, I'm going to build the biggest tower in England.
Yeah.
I mean, people do that in New York. People want to build the tallest building in New York, don't they?
Yeah,
but why?
Well, because there are a lot of tall buildings and you want to build a taller one.
Well,
I mean, that's really what it is.
That's good enough for real life, but it's not good enough for a novel.